potential risk of outside exposure. Now, there's another form of protection called hashing. Now, a lot of folks get hashing and encryption confused. Hashing doesn't use a key. Instead, what we have is an algorithm to take that original data and it's converting it into a unique fixed value. So what happens is you're entering in the same data using that same hashing algorithm, and you're using that as an identifier. And that's ultimately what's going to be produced. So instead of encryption, where you have a key that converts it back to its original form, hashing keeps the unique identifier. And so many organizations use hashing to store their passwords. This is actually a lot more secure to store passwords than storing them in plain text. Now, that doesn't mean attackers don't know about hashing. So that's where we've actually created what we call salted passwords. And what this means is that there's a random value in front of the hash value, so it's even more unique and more secure. Now, if your brain is spinning with all this extra information and you're wondering how you're supposed to implement all these different recommendations, and you still have to manage costs, well, never fear. Let me introduce you to one of my favorite tools, the Cloud Adoption Framework. What this is, it's a collection of documents with guidances and best practices that have been developed over time, and we have it with our largest customers, and we've developed it with subject matter experts. So if you're worried about securing your environment in the cloud, I would make sure that you're leveraging this free tool. It's going to help you create a strategy when migrating to the cloud, and it can help you build out an actionable plan with your desired outcomes. And when you are preparing, it's going to provide checklists and really make sure you're ready for that change. And then once you migrate, or what we call adopting the cloud, it can help you move over your existing workloads seamlessly. And it's going to help you improve your existing solutions. But here's what's neat. It doesn't just stop there. Once you're in the cloud, it can help with governance and really managing your workloads. And even if you aren't actively going through a migration right now, the Cloud Adoption Framework can help you plan and really implement various changes and improvements. All right, so we've covered some of the different security concepts. And I promise we are going to dig a little bit deeper into some of those areas throughout the next 2 sessions. But what I want to take a moment and discuss is some of the different identity concepts before we really move on. And here's something that you may not realize. Every single person in your organization, well, they have an identity, but it doesn't stop there. Every single device that has access to your resources also has an identity. And an identity is really just a user or device and how they're being recognized on your corporate network. And guess what? If someone or something has access to your data and resources, they're at risk for an attack. So this is why an identity is an incredibly important area when it comes to security. Now, we just learned what a dictionary attack is. And as a reminder, this is an identity-focused type of an attack that, and quite frankly, it's not the only one. There are several out there, and you need to be aware and protect yourself against them. Because remember, password 123 is the most common password in the world. And a password-based attack is where an attacker is going to take a list of, those super common passwords, those weak passwords, and basically what they're trying to do is match them to a list of known usernames. And phishing is going to be another common type of identity attack. And while this is phishing with a PH, it works somewhat similar to the way that we think of phishing. An attacker is actually going to dangle bait in front of your users, who in this case are the target or fish. And this bait can be an email that maybe it looks like it comes from your CEO or your boss asking for some information. Or maybe it's having you click on a link where they're entering in their username and password. Now, sometimes these phishing emails are easy to spot. They're really obvious. They have bad spelling, bad images. But here's the thing. Attackers are getting better and better. And so sometimes they can be difficult to identify. My best piece of advice for you is, when in doubt, don't click the link. Now, spear phishing is a more specific form of phishing. In this case, the attacker is going to have some sort of information, like a database or maybe an employee org chart. So the email is going to look like it came from your boss or maybe someone else you work with. I actually had one of these happen to me. I got an email and it looked like it came from my boss and it had the right signature, the right phone number, everything. And in the email, it said that she was with a customer and couldn't remember her password for an application, and so she was asking for mine. Now, I thought this was kind of fishy, no pun intended, but I gave her a call just to be safe, and she had no idea what I was talking about. So definitely, you're going to need to be careful when it comes to sharing information over email. And since there are so many different types of attacks focused on identities out there, it's important that you're doing everything to protect them. Remember our defense in depth chart? Well, it's our second layer. So we want to make sure we have a good line of defense. But here's the thing. I would argue it's turning into the first line of defense since we have so many remote workers out in the world and you may not be able to use the physical security as your first line of defense for all of your data. So how do you go about protecting your identity? Well, I don't want you to think of it as tied to a single user or a single device. Instead, I want you to think of it as something that encompasses your entire organization. And we've come up with 4 primary pillars when it comes to protecting your organization identities. First is your administration over your identities. You need to understand when and why identities are being created. But more importantly, you need to know how they're being managed. But I would actually say authentication and authorization are probably the 2 biggest pillars when it comes to identity. So first, let's talk about the difference between the 2. Authentication is where I'm verifying I am who I say I am. This may look like I'm putting in my username and password, and we are going to talk about multi-authentication later on. But just remember, authentication is where I am verifying and proving my identity. Now, authorization is about what level of access I have and what I can do with it. So think about it this way. When I travel somewhere, via plane, I need to go to the airport. And once I'm all checked in and I'm ready to head to my gate, what's the first thing I need to do? I need to go through security. And when I do, they're going to ask me for 2 things, my boarding pass and my ID. And what they're doing is they're verifying that I am in fact Chelsea Lee and my ID matches my boarding pass. They are authorizing me to go through security to the gates. Now, once I'm through, I just can't go anywhere I want in the airport and hop on any plane. No, I'm only authorized to go to certain points of the airport, like a waiting area or the restaurants, and I can't run out the door where the tarmac is without getting tackled by security. And what's more, I can only board a certain airplane at a certain time at a certain gate. And it has a certain destination. And even on the plane, guess what? I have a certain seat. I'm not authorized to hop on any plane and sit in first class. I'm only authorized for what my boarding pass says. So authentication is I am who I say I am, and authorization is what can I do? I would definitely make sure for your exam you know the difference. But this is something that I think is going to be helpful, knowing the differences for the rest of your studies. Now, the last pillar is, and it's really not the least pillar, but it's important, is auditing. Because it's important to understand who is, what they are doing, when, where, and why. And we're going to discuss all sorts of different tools so that way you can track your users and what they're doing and even help automate some of those different governance processes. But I actually want to take a moment and dig in a little bit deeper when it comes to the role of authentication and the change that we call modern authentication. But in order to do that, we have to go back in time to the good old client-server model days. In the past, you would have a client and a server. And usually what would happen is you have a user who is using the client and would do something like they would have a username and password. I mean, it's pretty similar to that, what we have today. But we had this for each server. And this could be a pain in the butt because think about it. If there were so many servers, a user would have to give their username and password each and every time. And, you would have to remember all of those usernames and passwords. And here's what would happen, is you would end up with multiple names and different names and passwords all across the different servers. So with modern authentication, we introduce a new player in the setup. This is a thing called an identity provider. And what we're trying to do, or what we're trying to change, is that we're no longer going to send a name and a password to the server. Instead, the client is going to go to get a thing, what we call a security token, from an identity provider. And the way that it does this is by presenting a name and a password to the identity provider. It may be a smart card, or it might be an authenticator app on the phone. It doesn't really matter. But there's a contract between the client and the identity provider. And we can get this thing called a security token from that identity provider. And then the client is presenting that security token to the server. The server is then able to take that token and validate that it's legitimate security token because the server has that trust relationship with the identity provider. And that trust relationship, say that this server can either send a token to an identity provider or to get it validated, or really the knowledge of that identity's provider sign-in key is enough to check the cryptographic signature on the token. Now you might be asking yourself, what is a token? It's simple. A token is just a signed document, a cryptographically signed document, and it contains things about the person using the client that are called claims. And a claim is simply information about that identity that's calling the server. And it doesn't actually have to be a person. It could be a device. It could be a software process. I mean, any of these things are an identity that are acting at the server level. So claims are just an attribute value pairs that are information about the identity that's using the servers. Later on today, we're going to be looking at Azure Active Directory, which is an example of a cloud-based identity provider. Now, another benefit of modern authentication is that you can create one credential that can be used for a number of applications and resources. And this is what we call single sign-on. Now, when you set up single sign-on between multiple identity providers, it's called a federation. So let's look at the graphic that we have here on the screen. We have a website that it uses the authentication services of IDPA, but the user is authenticating with IDPB. Now, even though they are two different services, there is an established trust relationship between IDPA and IDPB. So the credentials that the user logged on with IDPB are going to be passed to their website, and now they have access. What's really nice about this is that your users don't have to remember all sorts of different passwords. And really, you've probably used a federation service before. I mean, have you ever logged into a website or maybe created an account using social media? Like, what about LinkedIn? Well, in this case, LinkedIn is the identity provider, and there is a trust relationship between the website and LinkedIn. Now, one thing I do want to make note of is that there is a trust. Just because there is a trust relationship doesn't mean that it's bidirectional, and you have to set it up that way. So if I use my LinkedIn to access a website, unless that trusted relationship is set up as a bidirectional trust, that website can't log into my LinkedIn. The last section of this module I want to discuss is the concept of Active Directory. Now, we're going to be going into a lot more detail around Azure Active Directory in the next module, but I want to make sure that you understand what a directory is and how it's used. A directory is a hierarchical structure that stores information about objects on your network. All of that data is available to users and services and applications that are on your network. And if you've been around Microsoft for a while, you may have heard something called Active Directory. This is a directory service that came around Windows 2000, and it was designed for your on-prem networks. This was a great tool for both authentication and authorization in your on-prem environment. But guess what? Technology changed, and we moved to more mobile devices, and those are continuously being added to our networks. And Active Directory just didn't have the native support for modern authentication methods. And that's where Azure Active Directory came into the picture. You might hear me call it AAD. But Azure Active Directory was developed as the next generation of directory services for both your on-prem and your cloud environments. And like I said, we're going to cover all things Azure Active Directory in Module 3. But if you wanted to see a detailed comparison of Active Directory compared to Azure Active Directory, we have this phenomenal comparison guide in Microsoft Docs. You can find that at aka.ms/AD versus AAD. That's AD vs AAD. So let's go ahead and just wrap up this Module 1. And don't you worry, the fun is just getting started. This module is really just an introduction into some of the different security and identity concepts. We looked at a few different identity models or security models when it comes to Zero Trust or CIA, but we also looked at the different threats that you need to be aware of and really to protect yourself against. We've just scratched the surface when it comes to some of the tools like Azure Active Directory. That's coming in Module 2. And as a reminder for everyone, all of the material in my slides, plus extra videos and knowledge checks, are available for free in the learning path at aka.ms/scfunpath. But you know what? I'm thinking it's time for a quick break. So how about this? We're going to take a 10-minute break, give yourself a chance to digest some of these concepts, grab a drink of water, and when we come back, we're going to dive headfirst into Module 2, which is all about identity and access management solutions that are available inside of Microsoft 365. So I'll see you back here in 10.